Well, good afternoon and welcome to our RSK Biosenses First Thursday Club for June. I'm Gavin Wilson. I'm a director in Biosenses and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Libby Robinson, who's going to tell us about climate change risk assessments. But before I introduce Libby properly, I need to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So your microphones will be muted throughout the talk, but if you do want to ask a question, then you can do that via the question box on the screen. And please do so, as there should be time at the end for some discussion. Shortly after the end of the talk, you'll be sent a short questionnaire. And if you do have a few minutes to provide some feedback, we do appreciate it. It helps us to shape the webinar series going forward. Okay, by way of introduction, Libby is a principal consultant in the carbon and sustainability team in Nature Positive, which, as some of you might know, is RSK Biosenses' sister company. And she's worked here for 3 years. Libby's PhD was in climate change science, where she studied the effects of an intense warming event 92 million years ago. Although she has a background in oil and gas exploration, her career has taken something of a 180-degree shift in terms of how it relates to climate, as now she specialises in environmental due diligence and compliance. This involves corporate, asset and project-specific assessments on greenhouse gas emissions and climate risk. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Libby to talk about climate risk and Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, navigating the waters of a changing climate. Over to you, Libby.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I will just pop my camera off, so hopefully this will go full screen for everyone. But thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. It's nice to see so many familiar faces in the attendee list and so many people here today. So the presentation today will be rather two-pronged. Firstly, I'll introduce the concept of climate risk and delve into a little bit about the rules and regulations regarding this. In particular, I'll focus on the Task Force for Financial Related Disclosures. So that's the TCFD, as the global most widely adopted framework to assess climate risk. From this, I'll then talk a little bit more about the specific climate change risk assessment process and how companies can go about doing this. So to start off with, let's talk about climate risk. Climate change is scientifically recognised as generally increasing temperatures, raising sea levels, affecting patterns of precipitation and causing more frequent and intense extreme weather events globally. Whilst many countries have committed to net zero by 2050 and to align with the goals of the Paris Agreement, it's still recognised that adaptation measures will need to be made now to reduce the risk of impacts of climate change in the future. Now, the impacts of climate change are not just on the physical risk of climate hazards impacting assets and sites, but also the risk and uncertainty as companies have to adapt to the global transition to a lower carbon economy. And then there's associated changes in policy, technology, and market demand as well. So as I just mentioned, despite the ambitious carbon pledges across the world, both nationally and from corporations, action needs to be taken now to prevent the impacts of climate change in the short and the long term. So I kind of like to think of this as the carrot and the stick. The stick being the increasing number of requirements for businesses to understand their climate risk and adapt proportionately. In addition to this, they've got to meet regulatory requirements, and that's becoming increasingly crucial to meet stakeholder expectations and demands for sustainable finance. So investors, customers, employees, and other stakeholders are expecting organisations now to provide transparency on their approach to addressing climate change. However, of course, understanding climate risk is not just a tick box exercise. Understanding how the climate is likely to change can provide organisations with strategic positioning to leverage opportunities and mitigate risks for their company. On the subject of compliance, I'd like to apologise in advance here for the alphabet soup. I've tried to keep it as simple as possible throughout, but it really is hard to avoid the odd acronym here and there. So there are a number of frameworks globally to assess and disclose a company's climate risk. A very important one is the TCFD, as I mentioned, which I'll talk more about on future slides. This has also been integrated more recently by the ISSB's IFRS S2 climate-related disclosures, which is consistent with the TCFD framework, but it does develop it a little bit further and requires some more detailed information and provides additional guidance on the TCFD. A number of other more country or project-specific guidelines or frameworks exist. Many of these are based upon the principles of the TCFD. Notably, the EU will now require large and listed companies based in the EU and non-European companies with significant business in the EU to disclose information on risk and opportunities related to their ESG practices. And this is part of their Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So now this is broader than just climate. It includes pollution, water, waste, biodiversity, etc. But climate risk does remain a very important consideration of this. In the UK, we have TCFD aligned requirements in the form of mandatory climate related financial disclosures, which applies to publicly quoted companies, large private companies, and LLPs. So let's focus in a little bit more about TCFD. Why TCFD? Well, the task force was convened by the Financial Stability Board as a collection of industry experts across finance, insurance, and consultancy. This is with the view that money moves because of either risk or return and not because people care. Now, whilst that might be a slightly cynical take, the TCFD is a framework driven by investors wanting to understand the material climate impact on a business's finances. And this is to help them make more informed investment decisions. The framework helps assess, manage, and disclose climate-related risks and opportunities from a business and financial perspective to make climate change less theoretical and to emphasise the more tangible risks. So the task force was established in 2015. It released its recommendations in 2017 and has produced annual status reports thereafter, which are represented by these grey circles on the timeline here. As the number of supporters of these recommendations grew, in 2021, G7 and G20 countries pledged to promote the disclosure requirements of the TCFD. Towards the end of 2021, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, was formed to build upon the work of the TCFD, and they released their draft disclosure standards in 2022. By the end of 2023, upon the release of the TCFD sixth status report, the task force was disbanded, having fulfilled its initial remit. The recommendations of the TCFD have 4 pillars. The first one being governance, so that's the board's oversight of the risks and how the management framework manages these risks. Secondly, strategy, so how the identified risks are considered within the business. Risk management is how businesses are going about determining their material or significant risks and how they intend to manage these. And then metrics and targets. What are the businesses using to track their progress against any targets that they have set? So I like to think of this as the who, the why, the how, and the what. In a little bit more detail, so the governance pillar entails assessing who is internally responsible for assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities, with the recommendations to disclose the level of board oversight on these, and then the management's role in assessing their climate-related risks and opportunities. The strategy pillar assesses how climate-related risks and opportunities impact on a company's strategy and their financial planning. The recommended disclosures related to these are related to identifying the risks and opportunities across different timescales, the impact of these on the strategy and financial planning, and then the resilience of these strategies across different climate scenarios, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in future slides. The third pillar, risk management. This describes the process the business has for identifying and addressing climate-related risks, the process for managing these risks, and how these processes are integrated in the overall risk management system. The final pillar considers how a business goes about monitoring their progress. It's recommended to disclose any metrics used to assess the risk and opportunities, the direct and the indirect greenhouse gas emissions of the company operations, so that's in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and any targets that are used to manage climate-related risks and opportunities, and the performance of the company to date in the goal of those targets as well. So when it comes to the actual disclosure, The TCFD have 7 recommendations for effective disclosure, so shown on the left here. The disclosure should be a part of normal financial reporting using the financial reporting period. There's currently no external verification. It's recommended to use similar internal governance to those that are used within the financial reporting. And if disclosures haven't been made, the company must explain why this is the case. So in summary, TCFD should be seen as a tool and a set of recommendations to help bridge both risk and strategy. Now let's focus in a little bit on the risk component of TCFD and the practicalities of assessing your climate-related risks and opportunities. To recap, one of the 4 key pillars of TCFD is risk management. And the climate change risk assessment process is a powerful tool in order to identify, assess, and manage your climate-related risks and opportunities. However, climate change risk assessment isn't just important for compliance purposes, and it's not just for companies. It can be asset or project specific as well. It could be large scale, it can be small scale. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are a number of business reasons to get on top of any risk and opportunities presented by climate change. And the climate change adaptation process is an iterative process, starting with a climate change risk assessment, whereby you assess, so you identify material issues and stakeholders. You conduct a materiality and gap analysis, and then assess the impact on your organisation through a climate change risk assessment. You next get the planning phase. So this is where you design an adaptation program or plan to mitigate the risks that you've identified. You then act, so you implement these actions. You demonstrate accountability through commitments and policy changes. And then the final step is learning. You monitor and you evaluate the effectiveness of these adaptation plans through metrics and KPIs. You disclose how you're managing this risk. And then you start the process again with the lessons learned through the previous iteration of the cycle. So the rest of this presentation will focus primarily on this top circle. And that's the first step that kicks off the adaptation planning process, and that of conducting a climate change risk assessment. So the first step is to determine the scope. What level of detail is needed? As a first iteration, perhaps a high-level assessment to identify material and priority risks. Then you can determine the appropriate climate scenarios and timeframes. Once this has been done, you can identify the location-specific climate hazards that may impact that organisation or that asset. You must then understand any embedded mitigation or controls that are already in place. And that's to understand the vulnerability of the company or the asset to this specific climate hazard. For example, if a company has its main manufacturing plants on the banks of a river, has a flood risk assessment been undertaken? Are there any flood defences? Is there a flood management plan in place? So once you can understand this, you can identify specific risks to the company or the asset caused by the climate hazard, and then conduct a risk assessment matrix to quantify the likelihood of the hazard occurring, the vulnerability to that hazard, and then the consequence of that hazard occurring. So that's in brief. I'll go through some of these points in a little bit more detail. And something that I think is always good to explain is climate scenarios, because it's mentioned an awful lot. And perhaps it's one of these things that isn't explained very well, or is just gone over in high level. So with climate scenarios, we use representative concentration pathways, so RCPs. These were first described in the IPCC in their 5th assessment report. They're time-dependent projections of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration pathways up to 2100. So what that effectively means is that each RCP scenario describes the amount of warming the world may experience based upon the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So, for example, the lower numbers here, such as RCP 2.6, represents a scenario if all countries adopt and adhere to very stringent climate policies. There are fewer greenhouse gas emissions and warming is kept to a minimum. This is the kind of working best case scenario, but this moves up through the numbers, going through RCP 4.5 and then RCP 6, which are more middle of the road scenarios where countries adopt climate policies, but they're less ambitious than they could be, or they maybe do not adhere to these policies fully. Finally, the RCP 8.5 scenario is the result of the world sticking with the use of fossil fuels, really, with no abatement. It's used as the basis for most worst case scenarios, such as that used by the UK's Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment. Their guidelines for environmental impact assessments say to use this worst case assessment. You'll also notice on the table on the right a column titled SSPs. So these are shared socioeconomic pathways, and they've just been included here for context. Similarly to RCPs, they're illustrative scenarios of projected socioeconomic development up to 2100, and these were utilised by the IPCC 6th assessment report on climate change in 2021. These are more recently published than RCPs, but many climate projections, such as those from the UK Met Office, still use RCPs as their basis for their projections. In terms of timeframes, there's no TCFD or really universally accepted definition of short, medium, or long term. And it's best to choose those most appropriate to the company or the asset in terms of asset lifespan or the strategy vision of the company. So that can be something that is very bespoke dependent on the actual assessment that you are doing. The next step is to look at the specific climate hazards. So the EU taxonomy has identified these hazards relating to temperature, wind, water, and solid mass. Chronic hazards are representative of the shift of climate trends over longer times, whereas you get the acute events at the bottom there, which represent severe and sudden onset events. For the identified climate hazards at any one location, it's important to assess the historical trends, the current situation, and then consider the likely future projection of the climate across all relevant timeframes and scenarios. And there are a number of data sources out there to do so, depending on where you are looking at, ranging from the World Bank global data set to more country-specific projections, such as the UK Met Office climate projections. And these can really range in terms of granularity, ease of use, and scale, depending on which countries you need to assess. So that can be one of the challenges in terms of conducting a CCRA, is accessing these data sources and integrating them within the assessment. So, as mentioned previously, the risks associated with these hazards can be related to actual physical impacts of the hazard, and these generally comprise those related to the loss of operation or productivity, leading to financial risk, or those relating to the health and safety of the workforce. Some of these are listed below, which I'll let you read in your own time. But as well as this, there can be risks from society's response to climate hazards, such as those relating to the policy and legal landscape, from evolving technology, a changing market, and then increased reputational pressures on companies with regards to their ESG commitments as well. So dependent on the company, the industry, the asset, there can be a wide range of different climate-related risks that may become apparent with future climate change. So in order to assess this and go through the risk assessment process, you need to have a criteria in terms of how you're going to be assessing this risk. So this is a slide that I'll also be showing in the future in one of our examples, where you can use the likelihood of an event happening versus the consequence of this event happening as well. And then you can use a 5x5 matrix to quantify how significant or how material these risks are in terms of how likely they are to occur and what the consequence may be as well. And then through doing so, you can create a risk assessment matrix, quantify these risks based upon all the assessment criteria for all the climate scenarios, all the relevant timeframes. And this can be used as a basis to identify adaptation measures that can be adopted to reduce risk as well. So in my final 10 minutes or so here, I'm going to give a case study so you can kind of see how this works in action. I have a few slides here about a recent example we've worked on for some energy from waste sites in the UK. Now, the need for this wasn't driven by TCFD requirements in this case, but those of the Environment Agency in England. So all sites with an environmental permit are required to have a management system to identify and mitigate risks caused by their operations. Last year, the EA updated its requirements to include climate-related risks as well. So for those installations that were already operating, and there was a pressing need to conduct a climate change risk assessment by April 2024. The Environment Agency would then be inspecting and auditing this periodically via the routine compliance assessments and after any significant pollution event that they believe was influenced by extreme weather as well. So we've undertaken a number of these EA compliant climate change risk assessments. And I'll just go through this example here for an energy from waste site. So what were the steps that we went through? As I've already mentioned, as a first pass iteration, the assessment could be undertaken at a relatively high level to gain an understanding of the overall risk and screen any possible risks that may need to be assessed in more detail in the future. It's not looking at just the physical asset, but also the health and well-being of the staff, and then the impact on the local environment as well. So you should look at the timeframes most relevant to the assessment. In this case, it was the lifetime of the installation. And given the way the climate projection data is formatted, it made the most sense to look at it the short term until 2039, and then the medium term from 2040 to 2059. And then looking at the most relevant climate scenario. This can be dependent on the needs of the client or the risk tolerance of the organisation. However, in this case, the EA is particularly risk averse and required the most extreme worst case climate scenario to be used to align with the mean global temperature rise of 2 degrees by 2050 and 4 degrees by 2100. In terms of the climate hazards, so within the UK, these are some of the most prevalent. Many are related to flooding, associated with changes in precipitation and more intense storms and precipitation events, and this can be coupled with sea level rise in coastal areas. Other hazards include those related to the increase in temperature, so increased likelihood of heat waves, lack of summer precipitation leading to droughts, and then potentially associated wildfires as well. So you can see on the example on the right, we look at both the historical trends in the climate data and then also any climate projections for the area. In the UK, these climate projections are taken from the UK CP18 dataset. These are provided by the Met Office, but other countries often have their own national climate projections as well. So it's important to assess the site's vulnerability to these hazards, and there may already be control measures in place to mitigate some climate-related risks, which decreases their vulnerability. So here are some examples. Typically embedded mitigation or controls fall within these three groups. So those embedded in the site design, those mitigated by management plans, and those that are included in the operation of the site to increase the operational resilience. So once we've established the hazards, we've thought about the vulnerability of the site, we can then identify specific risks. These here are just a few examples, the top ones relating to the consequence of increased heat to these energy from waste sites. The bottom one is relating more to flooding. But it's important to note not just to consider the direct implications to the operation of the site, but in this case, in the bottom example, how climate change and the development itself can impact on the local environment as well. So it's kind of an in combination effect. So with the risks identified, we needed to have an established assessment criteria and also definitions as to how we ranked these risks. In this case, we used the 5x5 matrix on the right, ranking the likelihood of an event versus the consequence of that event happening. Now, it's very useful to quantify these definitions where possible. It makes them much easier to use. So, for example, if something happens annually, would you call it very likely? If it only happens once or twice in an asset's lifetime, would you call this unlikely? Or would you call this very unlikely? It's important to make these distinctions clear as part of the assessment process, so you have these benchmarks to use that remain consistent throughout the assessment. So from this, you can conduct a quantified risk assessment and identify priority and material risks to the business or to the site. In the example here, you can see on the right-hand side, that's just a snapshot of the Excel-based risk assessment that we came up with color-coded risks, so red for higher risk, green for lower risk. The columns at the top you probably can't make out, so they're all listed in these bullet points here on the left. And it looks at an RCP 8.5 scenario under a short-term and medium-term time frame. So also as part of this, you can identify any adaptation measures that may be necessary for priority and material risks, and then the residual risk determined upon the adoption of those measures. So the output of this and the deliverable of this should be then integrated within existing risk management frameworks and procedures, just to ensure that climate-related risks have been adequately considered throughout the business. So hopefully this has been a useful talk, and hopefully it may have triggered some thoughts from yourselves on useful next steps for you and your business and your work. But just to go through a few here, with all the changing regulation, it is wise at this point to consider whether your organisation falls under any TCFD related mandatory reporting requirements. Dependent on which country you're based or which country you operate in, this is often related to whether you are a limited company, the number of staff you have, your annual turnover, for instance. It's often related to the size of your company. If you are required to report aligned with TCFD recommendations, or even if you're not, but you decide to future-proof your business and implement some of these procedures, then a useful approach is to conduct a gap analysis against the requirements, and then undertake any further work you need in order to align with these requirements, so to plug the gaps, so to speak, and then to disclose the results of these within your annual reporting. If corporate TCFD requirements are not totally applicable to your work, it's still worth thinking about whether there are any other requirements in place that require you to think about climate risk. So, for example, the Environment Agency requirements for permitted developments. In addition, think about whether incorporating climate risk within your risk management system will generate benefits in terms of cost efficiencies, improved methodologies, or increased reputation amongst stakeholders. And even if you're not in a place to develop your climate risk processes and resilience, it is of course recommended in this rapidly changing regulatory landscape to remain aware of any changing requirements within your industry or your country. So with that, I shall finish there. Of course, you are welcome to share any questions here in the webinar, but there's also an email address there should you require any support or if you have any further questions after this. So thank you very much for listening. Gavin, I'll pass over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Libby. There we are, we're both back on, that's great. Yeah. Brilliant, thanks so much for what was really an illuminating overview of the climate risk assessments, and it's clearly relevant for all major companies really. And we've got a little bit of time, and we do have a couple of questions. I wonder if I could start. So you mentioned, you showed a range of climate projections. How do you decide on the right climate scenario for a risk assessment for a given company, a given client?
Yeah, so there are multiple approaches you can take. Many requirements may state what they require. So like I say, the Environment Agency required a worst case scenario, so at 8.5, and that is commonly the one used. But it depends upon the risk tolerance of the organisation, for instance. It's often useful to screen at a high level using a worst case scenario, so using the 8.5 scenario, and then with a view to then delve deeper into those priority risks and maybe look at how those risks will materialise under a slightly better case scenario, so maybe a middle of the road scenario, which is potentially maybe more likely, that's debatable, but just to see how those priority risks materialise under different climate scenarios. So do the high level screening, I'd recommend under a higher case, higher emissions scenario, and then iteratively see how they would look under different climate scenarios.
I see, thanks very much. That's great. Other questions that we have, let's have a look. So I've got one here, which is, for a business wanting to conduct a TCFD climate-related risk assessment, is there a template available to do this internally to help guide the process on what we should be covering? A lot of these requirements seem very global for a UK-based business.
Yeah, so in terms of template, the TCFD specific 11 recommendations just provides a really good framework to do so. So in the 4 slides, I went through the 4 pillars. Each one provided 2 or 3 recommendations as part of those pillars. And I think they're quite clear and quite concise in terms of what they need in order to be fulfilled and adhered to. So those 11 recommendations are the perfect starting framework to use to go through. And like I say, do a gap analysis. Do we comply with this? Do we not comply with this? What do we need to do in order to comply with this recommendation? So that's the first starting point you'd want to go. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fab. So there's another one here, quantitative versus qualitative assessment. I think you touched on this on your case study, about how much of the assessment is kind of numerical versus sort of qualitative expert judgment, or does that vary depending on, you know, the company, the client?
Well, I think the key thing here is you want to prioritize material risks. And so quantifying this within those assessment criteria that you've defined is a real powerful tool in order to do so. If you're just doing a qualitative assessment, yes, that's useful and it might be a good first pass, but I think the real power is by applying numbers to these, by quantifying it, because then you can identify the really material risks. So as a data scientist myself, I would always put numbers to things.
Yeah. Okay. And there's a question here that says, so you showed the adaptation cycle for companies, and I feel this may be a bit beyond, you know, the scope of your work, but is there evidence of companies acting on the assessment outcomes and making changes to their business strategies in order to reduce their climate-related risks that have been identified in the assessment?
Yeah, well, absolutely. That's the whole purpose of doing this, is to take the outcomes of the risk assessment, come up with adaptation policies and implement them. So where we tend to work in our part of the business is more on companies in the initial stages of their work. So we come up with the risk assessment, we come up with high-level adaptation, and then we can support them in coming up with adaptation policies, plans, implementation strategies, and so forth. So companies are doing this. A lot of the time you find they are quite early on in their journey. So a lot of companies are just doing the risk assessment process, coming up with adaptation strategies, but are very early on in terms of applying these. And they're not really at a point to, you know, you look at those metrics and targets and see how well they're doing and then go through the iterative process again. So I think companies are still quite young and fresh in this approach for the most part.
That does make sense, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I've actually got one other question, and it's does TCFD demand stakeholders to be involved in the assessment, or can it be done as desk work? I'm not entirely quite sure what that means, whether that's, you know, stakeholders beyond that company.
Yeah. I think the TCFD doesn't specify in particular about what stakeholders need to be considered or consulted within the process, but in order to do an effective climate change risk assessment, you do need to identify the right stakeholders to talk to. So whether that's the company themselves, who within that company, so people from the board, people from management, people from procurement, from risk management, from health and safety. There's a number of different people in different departments that you need to talk to in order to understand these risks to the company. Because the key thing here is to understand the vulnerability of that company to the climate hazards and how the company or the organisation operates. So you need to talk to a number of different people within that organisation. From an asset point of view, so if you were looking at more of a project-specific risk assessment, you know, the same themes are there. You need to talk to the right people. So you need to talk to the people that are on the ground, so people in charge of the operations, then also people in finance, people in procurement, people who are involved with supply chain. So yeah, stakeholders are very important, and you need to identify the right ones to make sure that you're getting the right information regarding the thing that you're assessing. But as far as I'm aware, the TCFD doesn't specify exactly what stakeholders these should be.
Yes, that's great. Okay, thank you very much. Well, that's all our questions. We've got a little bit of time in hand, but that's fine. I'd ask, so I think we'll wrap it up at that point. I'm going to remind those who are listening to take a moment, if you can, to complete the questionnaire that you'll get by email. And it just leaves me to say thanks again so much to Libby and to everyone for joining once again. And finally, before we sign off, one for the calendars, that the next First Thursday Club is on the 4th of July. And that will be presented by Paula Reason and will be on the updated BAT mitigation guidelines, and full details of that will follow in due course. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye for now.